In The Laws of Thought, Tom Griffiths makes this interesting comment about Eleanor Rosh's work, the former Berkeley psychologist. And it's really interesting. Like, she does some work in Papua New Guinea. She's a psychologist. She figures out that people in Papua New Guinea who have a very different language than we have here in English still tend to remember colors better or worse, very similarly to us. In other words, people totally, irregardless of their language and their thought process and their logic and whatever else their cognitive abilities and habits and customs are, nevertheless, they still have the same tendencies to remember, let's say, colors or shapes similarly to us. And this leads Griffiths to make this transition in the book, which is, by the way, an excellent book, uh, that it's a pivot in the book, but also in the history of intelligence research, from thought as formal logic to thought as approximating optimal inference under sensory and computational constraints. So the sensory and computational constraints that we are dealing with as humans give us a certain way to categorize the world. So basically the hardware decides the software. So this is bit from it, if you will. Bit from it. And this is David Deutsch. This is really profound philosophical, but also, in a sense, very important for the history of AI. And I think that's why it's in the book. And you have to give Tom, accolades for that, to make that connection. Because it is the sensory and computational constraints that define the categorization or the thought, or, if you will, even the logic, even the way we think is driven by the way we perceive the world through our hardware, which is our sensory system. And then the software is driven, so driven by that. So I guess vision has allowed us to put, for example, colors in different categories. We call it blue, red, green, but we could also call it easier to remember versus harder to remember, more in your face, less in your face, or whatever we want to use. And I think that's pretty powerful, because it leads to the more general notion of intelligence as being the computational part of a system's ability to achieve goals. Because I want to I'm not sure, I'm about halfway through the book. The word goal hasn't come up yet, because the way I see it is we have a sensory system and the hardware which defines our software. In other words, intelligence is driven by hardware, and that's very important. But in the end, it's also driven by goals, and that's the fundamental reason. So you could then ask yourself, well, why do we have the hardware that we have? Why did evolution pick vision, for example, and the corollary modeling system that our brain does with vision? Why is that the most efficient way? And according to Tom, it's because of the computational constraints and the hardware. So we have a very, very efficient brain with very little energy consumption. We have a software defined visual system, if you will. So our eyes take in pixels, but they are then basically compiling all that information into a world model that we can use to avoid tigers. I think what's interesting is the question, of course, how artificial intelligence, I mean, of course, this is, for us, this is the main question. How is artificial intelligence now different? And in particular, when it comes to robots, we've decided that vision is a very efficient system, and there's this whole religious war about how many sensors one should use. And we've always instinctively argued that vision is a good way to also constrain the software development teams to be forced to build on top of it with world models and all that other software compilation, because that's the way nature has evolved, and it seems to be a very efficient way. But we don't have to necessarily do what nature has been doing. We can use LiDAR, radar, and all these types of things, but it still begets the question of why nature actually didn't give us, better radar systems or smell or hearing or things like that. Instead, we have over-indexed on vision, and I guess it has to do with the fact that vision is a more general way to deal with real-world AI, with the real world, and therefore real-world AI is also better served with vision-only systems or very, very vision-focused systems. Vision is the sensory overlord.